The moment Belle Harper stepped off the stagecoach in Dry Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1878, every soul on that dusty Main Street turned to look at her, and more than a few of them laughed. She was not what Dry Creek had expected. She was not what any frontier town expected. She wore a pale blue dress that had seen better days but was still pressed with care, her dark hair pinned neatly beneath a wide-brimmed bonnet that had traveled with her all the way from Richmond, Virginia. She carried a leather satchel in one hand and a worn copy of Tennyson's poems in the other, and she stepped off that last rung of the coach with her chin lifted and her brown eyes wide, taking in the cracked wooden storefronts, the smell of horse and sawdust, the raw, enormous sky above the flat Texas plains that seemed to go on forever in every direction. "Lord have mercy," said a woman named Dora Hutchins, who ran the dry goods store and whose opinion carried considerable weight in Dry Creek. "That's the new school teacher. Appears so," said her husband Walt, chewing tobacco and squinting. "She won't last a month." Belle heard them. She had good ears and the wind was blowing in the right direction. She did not allow herself to falter. She had come 400 miles from Richmond after her father's business had collapsed, and her mother had passed from fever the previous autumn, leaving her with nothing but a small inheritance, a fine education, and the stubborn, quiet belief that she could be useful somewhere in this world. She had answered a notice in a Richmond newspaper calling for a school teacher in Dry Creek, Texas, and she had written a careful letter and received a reply from the town's mayor, a man named Harold Fitch, who had informed her she was hired on account of being the only applicant. Harold Fitch turned out to be a short, red-faced man with mutton-chop whiskers and a firm handshake that expressed both welcome and deep skepticism. He met her at the coach with a woman named Martha Greer, who was the wife of the local blacksmith and had agreed to board the new teacher. "Miss Harper," Harold said, tipping his hat, "welcome to Dry Creek. I do hope you understand what you've taken on. These children are rough. The land is rougher, and the parents," he paused to find his words. "Well, they'll need convincing." "I am accustomed to convincing, Mr. Fitch," Belle said pleasantly. Martha Greer, who was a stout, kind-faced woman with flour on her apron, took one look at Belle and smiled with genuine warmth. "Don't you mind Harold," she said. "Come on. I've got biscuits on." The schoolhouse was a single room with a leaky roof and desks that wobbled, but it had a decent chalkboard and enough primers for the 14 children who were enrolled, ranging in age from 6 to 14. Belle spent her first evening there alone, sweeping the floor, straightening the desks, tacking a map of the United States onto the wall beside the chalkboard, and arranging her small collection of books on the window ledge. She worked until the light failed and then lit a single oil lamp and sat at the teacher's desk and wrote in her journal about the enormous quiet of the plains at night, the way the stars were so thick and close that they seemed to press down toward the earth, and the distant sound of cattle in the dark. She did not write about the people who had laughed at her on the street. She would not give that moment the dignity of ink. The first week of school was an education for Belle as much as it was for the children. The children of Dry Creek were not bad. They were simply unaccustomed to anyone speaking to them with patience and without shouting. Their previous teacher, a man named Bart Cooper who had lasted 3 months, had apparently governed the classroom with a leather strap and a voice like a thunderclap. Belle had neither. What she had was a story. Every morning before lessons she told the children a story. Not a fairy tale exactly, but something with a beginning and a middle that stopped at a cliffhanger precisely when the morning light reached a certain window, so that the children spent all day working through their sums and their letters with at least part of their minds turning over what might happen next. The stories were about explorers and inventors and fierce women who crossed oceans. They were about a boy who discovered a cave of fossils in the Texas limestone and had to decide whether to tell the truth about what he found even though it would cost him something dear. The children listened with wide eyes and elbowing each other. By the end of the first week, 14 children were showing up, and 2 who had not been enrolled before were sitting on the windowsill outside hoping to hear the story. Belle enrolled them, but the parents were a different matter. On a Thursday evening during her third week in Dry Creek, Belle attended a town social held at the community hall behind the church. Martha had insisted she come, and Belle was grateful for the company because she did not yet know enough people to feel comfortable walking into a crowded room alone. The social was a lively affair with fiddle music and a long table spread with food, and the men gathered near the door discussing cattle prices and the uncertainty of rain, and the women gathered near the food discussing everything else. Belle was standing with Martha and trying her best to follow a conversation about the upcoming cattle drive when she overheard two ranchers' wives talking about her in the way that people talk when they want to be overheard. "She reads them poetry," said a woman named Clara Boone, whose husband ran one of the larger spreads north of town. "Poetry, out here. My Billy came home reciting something about a lady in a tower and I nearly fell off my chair." "She lets them call her Miss Belle," said another woman whose name Belle had not yet learned. "Not Miss Harper, Miss Belle, like she's their friend instead of their teacher. My Josie already thinks she hung the moon, which is fine enough I suppose, but will she teach them to be tough? Will she teach them what this land actually asks of a person?" "She won't last," Clara Boone said flatly. "She's too gentle, too soft. You can see it in how she holds herself. Too much Richmond and not enough Texas." Belle kept her eyes on her plate and her face arranged in its most composed expression. Martha's hand found her elbow and pressed gently. "Those two talk about everybody that way," Martha murmured. "Pay it no mind." But Belle did mind a little, not because it wounded her pride exactly, but because she understood what the women were really saying beneath the unkindness of it. They were afraid. They were afraid to let their children become attached to someone who would leave when the first hard winter came, as other teachers had left. They were afraid that gentleness was a liability on this land, and so they dismissed anyone who carried it. She could not entirely blame them for that. She had seen enough of the frontier in 3 weeks to understand that it asked hard things of people. The drought-cracked earth, the distances between neighbors, the unpredictability of weather and cattle prices, and the violence that could come out of the dark without warning. This land did ask for toughness. Belle simply did not believe that toughness and gentleness were mutually exclusive things. It was on the following Saturday morning that she met Wesley Graves. She had borrowed Martha's small buckboard and one elderly, reliable horse named Button in order to drive 3 miles out to the creek bed, where she had been told she might find cottonwood specimens worth pressing for the children's nature study. She had brought her specimen books and her pressing papers and a canvas bag, and she had set out in the early morning while the air was still cool and the light was long and gold across the plains. She was on her knees beside the creek bank examining a particular cluster of wildflowers, small, purple-throated things she could not yet name, when she heard hoofbeats approaching at a pace that was not hurried but was steady and deliberate, the kind of pace that belongs to someone who knows exactly where they are going. She looked up. The man who reined in his horse at the edge of the creek was perhaps 28 years old, lean and broad-shouldered in a way that suggested he had spent his entire life doing physical work and found it agreeable. He wore a battered brown hat, a work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and leather chaps over his trousers that were dusty with trail. He had dark eyes that were startlingly direct and a jaw that had not been introduced to a razor in perhaps 4 days. He sat his horse, a big gray animal with a calm, intelligent look, with the complete ease of a man who felt more natural in the saddle than out of it. He looked at Belle kneeling in the creek bed with her specimen books and her canvas bag and her blue dress hem already muddy at the edges, and he did not laugh. "Morning," he said. "Good morning," Belle said, straightening up and brushing her hands on her apron. "I hope I'm not trespassing. I was told this creek runs along the public land." "It does," he said. "For about another half-mile east." He tilted his head slightly. "You're the new school teacher." "I am Belle Harper." He touched the brim of his hat. "Wesley Graves. I run the Graves Ranch about a mile that way." He nodded toward the north. "What are you collecting?" "Wildflowers," she said. "For the children to press and label. I want to teach them the local flora. Most of them have lived here all their lives and don't know the names of the flowers growing at their own door." Wesley Graves looked at the flowers and then back at her, and something in his expression shifted, very slightly, from the polite wariness of a man encountering a stranger to something more considered. "That one's prairie verbena," he said, nodding at the purple-throated cluster she had been examining. "The yellow ones further along are black-eyed Susans. You'll find Indian paintbrush up on the ridge if you go about a quarter-mile north. Red as fire." Belle looked at him with genuine surprise. "You know the wildflowers?" "My mother did," he said. "Knew every one of them. Knew which ones the bees favored and which ones you could use for a poultice." He said it matter-of-factly, without any self-consciousness. "She taught me their names the way some people teach their children prayers. Said knowing the names of things was a form of respect." Belle felt something quiet and warm open up somewhere in her chest. She had not expected that. She had not expected anything like that from anyone in Dry Creek, not yet. "Your mother sounds like a remarkable woman," she said. "She was," he said simply, and something in the single word told her that his mother was no longer living, and that he had made a certain peace with that fact though it had cost him something to do so. There was a brief silence that was not uncomfortable. The creek moved softly between its banks and a mockingbird made an elaborate claim on a nearby cottonwood. "Do you have children at the school?" Belle asked. "No," he said. "Not married. I've got a ranch hand named Hector whose boy comes to your school, though. Hector talks about you." "Does he?" Belle said, and she could not quite tell from Wesley's expression whether that was a good or a bad thing. "What does he say?" Wesley looked at her for a moment with those direct, dark eyes. "He says you're too gentle for this country." There it was again. Belle lifted her chin slightly and looked back at him without flinching. "And what do you say?" she asked. Wesley Graves turned his horse a fraction so that he was looking out across the flat, sun-hammered plain, and then he looked back at her, and his voice was quiet and certain as a man who had thought about something long and arrived at a conclusion he would not easily be moved from. "I say gentle is what this land needs," he said. Belle Harper did not say anything for a moment. The mockingbird went on singing. The creek went on moving. The morning light laid itself across the prairie grass in long, warm sheets, and something in Belle that had been holding itself slightly braced since she arrived in Dry Creek let go a little, like a fist uncurling. "Well," she said at last. "That is an unusual opinion for Dry Creek." "I've got a lot of unusual opinions," Wesley said, and the corner of his mouth moved in what was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. He swung down from his horse then, which surprised her, and walked to the edge of the creek and crouched down with the ease of a man who had spent a great deal of time crouching at creek edges. "If you're going up to find the Indian paintbrush," he said, "watch the ground on the north side of the ridge. Rattlesnake country this time of year. You want to make a little noise as you walk." "Thank you," she said, and she meant it. He straightened and remounted in one fluid motion. "Miss Harper," he said, touching his hat again. And then he rode north along the creek at that same steady, deliberate pace, and Belle stood watching him until the gray horse and its rider were small against the enormous sky. She found the Indian paintbrush exactly where he had said. Over the following weeks, the landscape of Belle's life in Dry Creek began to shift and settle into something that felt, if not yet like home, then like the beginning of home. The children came to school reliably now, and she had begun to see real progress in their reading, which gave her a satisfaction she had not quite anticipated. A boy named Thomas Reyes, who was 12 and the son of a Mexican cattle hand, had a particular gift for arithmetic that Belle recognized and began to nurture carefully, giving him additional problems to solve and praising his work in front of the class in a way that made him stand a little straighter. A girl named Anna Hutchins, Dora's daughter, which Belle found deliciously ironic, had a fierce imagination and began producing written stories of such vivid, untamed quality that Belle took to reading them aloud on Friday afternoons as a reward for the week's work. The parents did not warm quickly, but they warmed incrementally. Dora Hutchins, to her credit, was practical enough to acknowledge that her daughter's writing had improved dramatically. Walt Hutchins, who said almost nothing, left a sack of flour on the schoolhouse step one morning without explanation, which Martha told Belle was the closest Walt Hutchins ever came to a compliment. Clara Boone remained skeptical, but her son Billy had memorized the poem Belle had been reading to the class, Tennyson's The Charge of the Light Brigade, and had recited all 6 stanzas at Sunday dinner to his parents' complete astonishment, so even Clara was running low on ammunition. Wesley Graves did not come into town often. He was a ranching man, and his days were structured by the demands of cattle and weather and land. But when he did come into Dry Creek, he always seemed to cross paths with Belle in ways that were mostly coincidental, and occasionally she began to suspect, not entirely so. He found her one afternoon at the general store, struggling to reach a high shelf, and without comment he reached over her and brought down the box of chalk she needed. He found her another time at the livery where she had gone to check on Button and ask about a loose shoe, and he spent 20 minutes showing her how to inspect a horse's hooves herself, so she would not be at the mercy of the livery man's assessment. He said, "A woman living out here ought to know her horse," and he said it with such simple directness that it sounded less like a criticism and more like a gift. She began to watch for him. She noticed she was doing it and found the noticing interesting rather than troubling. There was something about Wesley Graves that was different from the other men in Dry Creek in a way she struggled to articulate in her journal. He was not softer than they were. He worked as hard as any of them and was clearly respected by the men who worked for him. But there was a quality of attention in him, a quality of listening that was rare, and when he looked at her, he did not seem to see what the others saw when they looked at her. He did not seem to see the blue dress and the Tennyson poems and the Richmond upbringing and conclude gentleness equals weakness. He seemed to see something else, and she was curious enough about what that something else might be to keep the door of the acquaintance open. In late April, Dry Creek had its first real crisis of Belle's tenure there, and it came from an unexpected direction. A fever swept through town. It came on fast, the way illness often did in close communities, and within a week 3 of Belle's 14 students were sick, 2 with moderate fevers and 1, Thomas Reyes, her gifted mathematician, seriously enough that the doctor, a bespectacled man named Dr. Aubrey who rode a circuit and arrived in Dry Creek only on alternating Tuesdays, looked grave and said the boy needed rest and careful nursing, and that it was in the hands of the Lord. Thomas's mother, a thin, frightened woman named Consuelo, sat by the boy's bed in the small adobe house at the edge of town and looked as though she had not slept in 3 days, which she had not. Her husband, Hector, was out on the cattle drive that had left 2 weeks before and would not return for 6 weeks, and there was no one to help Consuelo except a neighbor who had her own family to attend to. Belle closed the school for the week and went to sit with Thomas. She was not a nurse, and she made no claim to be one. But she had nursed her mother through the last weeks of her illness, and she knew the rhythms of fever, knew how to keep a cool cloth properly cold and changed at the right intervals, knew how to coax water into a person who did not want to drink, knew how to read to someone who was too ill to hold a book themselves in a way that was quiet and calm, and gave the listening person something to hold onto while they were fighting their way back from the worst of it. She read to Thomas. She read him adventure stories and the science of the stars and the history of Mexico, which made Consuelo lean forward in her chair with an expression of complicated emotion. She sat with them through 2 nights and 2 days, going back to Martha's only to change her clothes and eat and sleep a few hours, and then returning. On the 3rd day, Thomas's fever broke. Consuelo wept with relief and exhaustion and clutched Belle's hands and spoke to her in Spanish, rapid and heartfelt. Belle understood enough to know she was being thanked, and she squeezed the woman's hands back and said, in her careful, unpracticed Spanish, "He is very strong and very smart. You should be very proud." It was Wesley who found her afterward, sitting on the step outside the Ray's house in the late afternoon. Her hair escaped from its pins and her dress wrinkled, looking out at the street with the expression of someone who has been running for 3 days and has only just stopped. He sat down on the step beside her, which was not something men in Dry Creek generally did without considerable preamble, but Wesley Graves had apparently decided that considerable preamble was an unnecessary waste of time. "Martha told me," he said. "How is he?" "Better," Belle said. "Fever broke this morning. He was asking for biscuits by noon, which I take as an excellent sign." Wesley looked at her profile and then looked at the street. "You've been here 3 days," he said. "His father's on the drive," she said simply. "His mother couldn't do it alone." "A lot of people in this town would have said that wasn't a teacher's business," Wesley said. Belle turned to look at him then. "He is my student," she said. "He is absolutely my business." Wesley looked at her for a long moment, and then he looked away, and there was something in his face that was quiet and intense and careful, like a man examining something he had thought about privately for a long time, and was now seeing confirmed before him. "Let me drive you back to Martha's," he said. "You look like you're about to fall off that step." She was, in fact, about to fall off the step. She was exhausted in every bone. "Thank you," she said. He helped her up with a hand under her elbow, and she was too tired to feel self-conscious about leaning on it slightly more than was strictly necessary, and he was too thoughtful to make anything of it. He had a horse and a small wagon, and she climbed up beside him, and they drove the short distance to Martha's house in the golden late afternoon light while the dust rose and settled around the wagon wheels and the smell of supper fires drifted from open windows along the street. "Mr. Graves," she said. "Wesley," he said. She hesitated. "Wesley," she said. "Why did you say that the first morning we met, about gentle being what this land needs? I've been thinking about it ever since." He was quiet for a moment, managing the horse around a rut in the road. Then he said, "Because I've watched this country eat people, not just the ones who aren't tough enough. The tough ones too. I've watched men who came out here hard and got harder every year until there was nothing left in them but the hard. And I've watched the land do the same thing, get stripped and driven until the topsoil blows away and the creek runs thin. Toughness on its own just keeps taking. Gentleness is what repairs things, what builds things back up." He paused. "My mother used to say that. She said you need both, but the people who remember to be gentle are the ones worth knowing." Belle thought about that. They had reached Martha's gate and Wesley pulled the horse to a stop and turned to look at her, and the evening light was behind him and his face was in shadow but his eyes were not. "Your mother was right," Belle said. "I know," he said. And this time the corner of his mouth did move into a proper smile, brief and genuine and warmer than she had expected it to be, and Belle felt her heart do something inconvenient and notable in her chest. She climbed down from the wagon and went inside to sleep for 11 hours straight. May came in blazing and bright, and with it came the particular social rhythm of the Texas frontier spring. The cattle drive returns, the branding, the church picnic, the slow, long evenings on porch steps when the heat broke after sundown and neighbors visited in the blue dark dusk. Belle had been in Dry Creek for 2 months now, and the town had begun to feel less like a foreign country and more like a difficult relative, the kind you don't entirely understand but have developed genuine affection for. Her school was going well. She had added 2 more students, both from ranching families who had held back waiting to see if she would last, and the existing students had progressed enough that she had begun to differentiate her lessons, pushing the older and more advanced students further while giving more individual attention to the ones who needed it. The leaky roof had been fixed, somewhat mysteriously, over a weekend when she had not been in the schoolhouse, and when she arrived on Monday morning to find dry floor and solid ceiling, she had looked at Martha with a question and Martha had simply said, "There are people in this town who show appreciation in practical ways," and would not say more. But it was the cattle drive return that changed things. Hector Reyes came back from the drive in the second week of May, lean and trail-worn and deeply grateful to find his son recovered. He came to the schoolhouse on his second day back and stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and told Belle that what she had done for his family was something he would not forget, and that if there was ever anything she needed he would do it, and his voice had a roughness in it that was not from the trail. He also told her, because Hector was the kind of man who believed in the full truth, that there was some agitation in town about her. Not about Thomas. About the town meeting that was coming at the end of the month, at which the question of renewing her teaching contract for the following year was going to be raised. Harold Fitch was supportive, Hector said, but Clara Boone's husband, Randall Boone, had apparently decided that the new teacher was too permissive, too gentle, too unlike what a frontier schoolteacher ought to be, and had begun campaigning against renewal in the way that influential ranchers campaign, which is to say quietly and persistently, and by leveraging the opinions of other influential men. Randall Boone thinks Billy should be learning how to break horses instead of memorizing poetry, Hector said, with a diplomatic effort to be fair to all parties. He thinks you are making the children soft. Billy Boone is 9 years old, Belle said, and there was a quiet precision in her voice that made Hector blink. He has the rest of his life to learn to break horses. He has a very short window in which to learn to read properly and to think clearly, and I intend to use it. Hector looked at her for a moment and then he laughed, a short, genuine sound. "Miss Harper," he said, "I hope you stay." She hoped so too. The week before the town meeting, Wesley Graves came to the schoolhouse. He came in the afternoon after the children had gone home, and he knocked on the open door and stood in the frame with that unhurried quality of his, hat in hand. Belle was erasing the chalkboard. She turned at the knock and something in her chest did that inconvenient thing again. "Come in," she said. He came in and looked around the room with its maps and its books on the windowsill, and the children's pressed wildflowers now pinned in careful rows on a piece of burlap that hung beside the door, each one labeled in a different child's handwriting. He looked at the burlap for a long moment. "Thomas labeled the prairie verbena," Belle said. "He spelled it correctly on the first try." "He's a sharp kid," Wesley said. "He is," she agreed. She set down the eraser and turned to face him fully. "Is this a social call or have you come to tell me something?" He looked at her with something that was almost amusement. "Both," he said. "I've heard about the meeting about Randall Boone." "So has most of the town," she said. "Randall Boone is a hard man," Wesley said. "Not a bad one exactly, but a hard one. He's been on this land 20 years and it's taken a lot from him, and he's decided that hardness is the only honest response to it. He's wrong, but he comes by it honestly." He paused. "He's also the largest taxpayer in the county, which means his opinion carries more weight than it perhaps ought to." "I know," Belle said. "I'm not naive, Wesley." "I know you're not," he said immediately, and the readiness of it pleased her. "What I am," she said, sitting on the edge of her desk and folding her hands in her lap, "is prepared to make my case. I have the attendance records and the progress reports and the letters from parents, and I intend to present them clearly and let the community decide." "That is how it should work," Wesley nodded slowly. "I'll be at the meeting," he said. "You are not obligated," she began. "I know I'm not obligated," he said. He met her eyes and held them. "I want to be there, Belle." It was the first time he had called her Belle and not Miss Harper, and the way he said it was quiet and sure, and neither of them pretended not to notice it, and neither of them said anything about it, but the air in the schoolroom changed slightly, became warmer and more particular. "Thank you," she said. He stayed another half hour. They talked about the children, about Texas in the drought years, about his ranch and his mother's garden, which had gone somewhat to seed since her passing 2 years before, but which he was thinking of trying to revive. He asked her about Richmond, and she told him honestly that she missed the green of it, the trees and the river and the particular quality of the eastern light, but that she found she missed it less than she had expected. "This light is different," she said, gesturing at the window where the late afternoon was burning the sky amber and orange. It's fiercer, less soft, but there's a beauty in it that I didn't expect. It grows on you, Wesley said. Yes, she said, and they were both talking about the light, and neither of them was only talking about the light, and they both knew it, and it was one of those conversations that felt like two people standing on opposite sides of a threshold and both leaning forward very slightly. He left before dark, and she sat at her desk for a long time afterward with her hands folded and a smile she was not trying to suppress. The town meeting was held on the last Thursday evening of May, in the community hall with its long pine tables and its coal oil lamps, and most of the adults of Dry Creek either sitting in rows or standing along the walls. It was the kind of meeting that functioned as social occasion and civic drama simultaneously, and people had dressed for it accordingly. Belle wore her best dress, which was a deep green wool that she knew complemented her coloring, and she had pinned her hair properly and carried her leather satchel with her records and reports inside. She sat in the front row next to Martha, whose expression was firmly supportive, and she was aware of the room arranging itself around her in ways both friendly and unfriendly. Harold Fitch opened the meeting and ran through several items of town business before he arrived at the question of the school. He presented Belle's case clearly and honestly, noting the improved attendance and the positive feedback he had received from parents, and then he opened the floor. Randall Boone stood up. He was a large, weathered man with a voice like gravel and the air of someone accustomed to being agreed with. He laid out his objections methodically and without particular anger. The children needed discipline, not encouragement. The curriculum was too literary and not practical enough. A teacher who spent her time nursing sick children was not focused on her actual duties. A woman from the East could not understand what this land required of those who lived on it. He was not cruel about it. He was worse than cruel. He was measured and reasonable sounding, and he made the dismissal of everything Belle had done seem like calm, sensible thinking. When he sat down, several men along the wall nodded. Belle stood up. She opened her satchel and took out her records, and she read the attendance numbers, which had improved from an average of 9 students per day to 14. She read the progress reports she had written on each child, specific and detailed, noting improvements in reading, in arithmetic, in writing. She read a letter from Consuelo Reyes that Consuelo had asked her neighbor's daughter, who had some English, to help her write. The letter said, in formal and careful language, that the schoolteacher had sat with her son for 3 days when he was ill, and that in her experience this was a woman who understood that being a teacher meant caring for the whole child, and that she hoped Miss Harper would stay. Then Belle set down her papers and looked at Randall Boone directly. "Mr. Boone," she said, "you have suggested that I cannot understand what this land requires. I want to respectfully suggest that I have been here long enough to begin to understand it very well. This land asks for resilience, for adaptability, for the willingness to do whatever is needed regardless of whether it falls within your assigned role. I sat with Thomas Reyes because it was needed. I learned to check a horse's hooves because it was needed. I adjusted my curriculum when I found out what my students needed most, which was not always what I had assumed they would need. I submit to this community that the qualities you associate with gentleness, patience, attention, the willingness to listen and adapt, are not weaknesses. They are exactly the qualities that allow people to survive and build something lasting on hard ground." The room was very quiet. "I am not asking you to keep me because I am comfortable or because I fit your idea of what a frontier teacher ought to look like," she said. "I am asking you to keep me because 14 children are learning, and because I intend to keep teaching them as long as you'll have me." She sat down. Martha squeezed her hand so hard it hurt. The vote was 12 in favor of renewal, 4 against. Randall Boone was in the 4, and he accepted the outcome without visible rancor, because he was a hard man but also a fair one, and when the count was read he nodded once and did not make a scene. After the meeting, Belle was standing outside in the warm night air, accepting congratulations, and slightly overwhelmed by the relief moving through her, when Wesley materialized at her elbow with a quietness that was characteristic of him. "Well said," he said simply. She turned to look at him and found that her composure, which had been perfectly adequate through the entire meeting, was slightly less adequate now in the dark with him standing close and looking at her with those direct, serious eyes, and she had to take a small, steadying breath. "Thank you for being here," she said. "I would have spoken if you'd needed it," he said. "I didn't need it," she said. "No," he said, and the simple certainty of it was the nicest thing anyone had said to her in a long time. "You didn't." The summer of 1878 arrived on the Texas plains like something that had been waiting impatiently behind a door. The heat was significant and unironic, but Belle had discovered by then that the Texas summer had a quality that the Virginia summer did not, which was that the evenings were magnificent. When the sun went down, the heat eased, and the sky went through a sequence of colors that she never got tired of watching, and the plains in the twilight had a beauty that was spare and vast, and entirely unlike anything in her previous experience. School recessed for the summer weeks in accordance with the farming schedule, which meant that the children were needed for harvest work and cattle work in the hot months, and Belle found herself with a different rhythm of days. The mornings she spent in a correspondence course she had ordered from a university in Austin, extending her knowledge of natural science and American history. The afternoons she spent doing the dozen small things that needed doing for the school's preparation for fall. And the evenings she spent sitting on Martha's porch watching the colors change in the sky. Wesley Graves began joining her on the porch. Not every evening, not in a formal or declared way. But perhaps 3 evenings out of 7, he would arrive on his horse in the cooling dusk and hitch it at Martha's gate and come up the porch steps, and Martha would bring out a second glass of lemonade without being asked, and Wesley and Belle would sit and talk until the first stars came properly out. They talked about everything. They talked about the land and the weather and the news from Austin, which arrived in the newspaper 3 days late and was treated as current. They talked about books. Wesley read more than she had expected, practical volumes about ranching and geology, and a battered copy of Shakespeare that he had inherited from his father, and had read several times through in a way that surprised and moved her. They talked about their families, about his father who had homesteaded this land and his mother who had made it habitable, about her own parents and the Richmond childhood, and the gap that her mother's death had left in her, a gap she was learning to carry rather than fill. One August evening, sitting in the blue dusk while the cicadas performed their enormous chorus in the dark, Wesley said, "I want to show you something tomorrow morning, if you're willing to get up early." "How early?" she asked. "Before sunrise," he said. "All right," she said without hesitation, and he looked at her with a small, pleased expression that she had learned to watch for because it was rare and genuine. He collected her at 4 in the morning with 2 horses, Button for her and the gray for himself, and they rode north out of town in the absolute dark, navigating by starlight and Wesley's thorough knowledge of the land, and he led her up onto a limestone ridge that she had not yet reached in her specimen collecting, and they dismounted and sat on the flat rock at the ridge's edge and waited. The sunrise on the Texas plains from a high ridge was something that Belle would remember for the rest of her life. It did not come gently. It came in a rush of gold and rose and deep orange across the entire horizon, which was uninterrupted by trees or hills for as far as the eye could follow, and the light poured across the grassland and the distant cattle and the pale thread of the creek and the thin line of Dry Creek's buildings, and it seemed to Belle that the whole world was being poured full of something, and that something was light and warmth and the particular mercy of another morning. She felt Wesley watching her more than the sunrise. She turned to look at him, and he was sitting with his arms resting on his knees, and he was looking at her with an expression that was entirely open in a way she had not seen his face be open before, all the careful quietness gone, and there was something in that openness that made her breath stop briefly. "Wesley," she said. "I know," he said. And then, because he was not a man who wasted words or complicated simple things, "Belle, I have been trying to find the right way to say this for 2 months, and I have decided there probably isn't a right way and I should just say it." She waited. "I would like to court you," he said, "properly. With your permission and your genuine interest in the matter, not out of convenience or proximity, but because I think you are the most remarkable person I have ever met, and I think I have been halfway in love with you since the morning I found you in the creek bed talking to the prairie verbena." Belle looked at him in the rising light of the Texas morning and felt something enormous and quiet settle over her like a hand laid gently on her shoulder. "I was not talking to the prairie verbena," she said. "You were examining it very closely," he said. "It amounted to the same thing." She laughed. It came up from somewhere honest and deep, and the sound of it surprised her. Wesley smiled at that, a full, genuine smile that changed his whole face and was one of the finest things she had ever seen. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "Yes, you'll let me court you, or yes to all of it?" "All of it," she said. "Both. I think I have been halfway in love with you since you told me my mother was right without having met her." He reached over and took her hand where it rested on the limestone, carefully, as though it were something he had been thinking about for a long time and wanted to do properly, and her fingers curled around his without any hesitation at all. They sat on the ridge until the sun was fully up and the heat of the day was beginning to build, and then they rode back down to the plain with their horses walking close together, and the morning light behind them, and neither of them talked much, because talking was unnecessary, and would have interfered with the particular quality of the silence between them, which was the very best kind of silence, the kind that means two people are completely comfortable with each other and know it. The courtship of Belle Harper and Wesley Graves proceeded with a warmth and a deliberateness that was characteristic of both of them. It was not a courtship of grand gestures, though it had its moments of grandeur. It was primarily a courtship of daily attention, of small things done with care and consistency. He brought her books he thought she would like, and she brought him cuttings from the wildflowers she was cultivating along the schoolhouse fence. He taught her to ride properly, spending 3 Saturday mornings in the corral on his ranch taking her through the basics with a patience and precision that impressed her. And by the end of the 3rd Saturday, she was cantering comfortably, and he was standing in the middle of the corral, watching her go around with the expression of a man who is quietly proud of something and not bothering to hide it. She taught him, in return, to press wildflowers, which he tolerated with good humor and actually became somewhat invested in, particularly the specimens from the ridge, which he said should be documented because there were plants up there that he had not seen anywhere else on the plain. They were seen together in town with increasing frequency, and Dry Creek being Dry Creek, opinions were formed and shared. Martha, who had known this was coming since approximately the 2nd week of May, was straightforwardly pleased. Harold Fitch approved because Wesley Graves was a man of solid reputation, and because he had learned by now that Belle Harper's happiness tended to make the school run better, and better-run schools reflected well on mayors. Dora Hutchins said that it was about time someone should look after the girl. Clara Boone said nothing but was observed smiling slightly when she saw them talking outside the general store on a Tuesday morning. Hector Reyes told Wesley privately that if he did anything to hurt Miss Harper, Hector would have a serious opinion about it, and Wesley received this threat in the spirit in which it was offered and thanked Hector for it, which was apparently the correct response. The only sour note came from a man named Caleb Pratt, who was one of the cowboys who worked seasonally in the area, and who had apparently decided in the absence of much evidence that he himself had some interest in the new schoolteacher, and was not pleased to see that interest preempted. Caleb was a man with more bravado than sense, and a tendency to express displeasure loudly in the saloon, and he made some remarks on a Saturday night that were reported to Belle by Martha, with the diplomatic editing of a woman who wanted to convey the essential facts without the exact vocabulary. The essential facts were that Caleb had said Wesley Graves was too quiet and too settled to keep an Eastern woman happy, and that Belle Harper would get bored and leave before Christmas. Belle heard this and felt a small, clean anger move through her, not on her own behalf but on Wesley's. The following Monday she encountered Caleb Pratt on the street outside the post office, and she stopped and looked at him directly and said, pleasantly and with complete clarity, "Mr. Pratt, I understand you've been sharing opinions about my private life. I want to tell you as a courtesy that your assessment of my character is incorrect, and your assessment of Wesley Graves's character is even more so. And if you continue to share these opinions in public places, I will consider them the business of whoever happens to hear them, including Wesley himself, who I suspect will have a more direct response than I have offered." Caleb Pratt stared at her for a moment and then touched his hat and walked away at a notably accelerated pace. Dora Hutchins, who had witnessed this from the doorway of her store, told everyone she knew about it, and by evening it had become one of those small-town legends that acquire extra details in the retelling and is referenced for years afterward as evidence of a person's character. Wesley heard about it, as he heard about most things in Dry Creek eventually, and when he next saw Belle he looked at her with an expression that was both amused and something deeper, and he said, "I hear you defended my honor." "I defended both of ours," she said, "which I am perfectly capable of." "I know you are," he said. And again the readiness of it, the certainty of it, which seemed to be a fundamental quality of how Wesley Graves thought about her, made something warm move through her that she was not sure she had a precise word for, but that she thought, privately, might be love in its fullest and most settled form. September came and school resumed, and Belle threw herself back into the rhythm of the classroom, with the additional energy of a woman who had spent the summer falling in love, and found that love, instead of distracting her from her purpose, had given her more of it. She was sharper and more inventive that fall, more playful in the classroom and more exacting in her expectations, and the children, who had come back from summer taller and more confident, rose to meet her. Thomas Reyes, now fully recovered and fully 13, had developed a secondary passion for astronomy alongside his arithmetic, and Belle had written to a university in Austin for a star atlas which had arrived, slightly battered, and which Thomas treated as though it were a sacred object. She began spending one Friday evening per month after dark on the schoolhouse step with whoever wanted to come, and the star atlas open on her knees, pointing out the constellations, and it turned out that adults came as often as children, drawn by the novelty and the darkness and the way Belle explained things as though they were genuinely interesting, which they were. Wesley always came on star nights. He would bring coffee, which he carried in a battered tin pot from the ranch, and hand out cups to whoever wanted them, and then sit slightly apart from the main group and watch Belle with the star atlas with an expression that was completely unguarded and entirely fond. One October star night, when the others had gone home and the two of them were sitting on the schoolhouse step alone with the coffee pot between them and Orion rising bright and cold in the east, Wesley said, "I want to ask you something. I want to ask it right this time." Belle looked at him. He was turned toward her and the starlight was enough to see his face and his expression was serious and certain and slightly, she had not seen this in him before, slightly nervous. "Belle Harper," he said, "I love you. I have loved you since the beginning of this, and I am not inclined to be careful about it anymore. Will you marry me?" The night was enormous and cold and perfectly still, and the stars were burning in their ancient patterns overhead, and Belle Harper felt her whole life balance on the point of a single moment. "Yes," she said, and the word came from somewhere so fundamental and certain that it did not feel like a decision. It felt like a recognition of something that had always been true. "Yes, Wesley, I will marry you." He took her face in both his hands that were rough from working the land and careful as everything he did was careful, and he kissed her for the first time, there on the schoolhouse step under the October stars, and it was the kind of kiss that establishes itself as the beginning of everything rather than a point along the way. They sat there a long time afterward, her head on his shoulder and his arm around her, the coffee growing cold between them and the night going on brilliantly above, and neither of them felt any need to go inside. They were married in the Dry Creek Church on the first Saturday of December, 1878, in a ceremony that the whole town attended because the whole town had developed, by various routes and at various speeds, a considerable investment in these two particular people and their happiness. Belle wore a dress that Martha had helped her make from ivory wool, simple in its lines, but finished with careful embroidery at the collar that Belle had done herself on the long evenings of November. She carried a small bouquet of dried wildflowers that included prairie verbena, which she had pressed and dried in August and kept specifically for this purpose. Wesley stood at the front of the church in a suit that had been pressed by Hector Ray's wife, with the kind of precision that expressed both affection and high standards, and when he watched Belle come up the aisle on Harold Fitch's arm, it was Harold who walked her, since she had no father or brother present, and he did so with a dignity that suggested he understood the honor of it. Wesley's face did something that every person in the church saw and that several of them never forgot. He looked at her the way people look at things they can barely believe are real, with a wonder that had nothing performative about it, and his eyes were bright in the lamplight. The vows they spoke were the traditional ones, but they said them to each other with a directness and a completeness that made the traditional words feel newly minted. The celebration afterward in the community hall went on until late, with the fiddle playing and the long tables spread and children running between the legs of the adults, and Consuelo Reyes danced with Thomas in a way that made everyone smile, and Martha cried happily at appropriate intervals, and even Randall Boone shook Wesley's hand and told Belle that his Billy had been reading on his own at night by lamplight, and he supposed that was something to be grateful for, which was as close to an apology as Randall Boone was constitutionally capable of producing, and Belle received it with full grace. They spent their first night as husband and wife at the ranch, which Belle had visited many times through the courtship, but which felt different now, felt like hers in a way that was both new and entirely natural. The ranch house was solid and well built, 2 stories of limestone with a wide porch and the overgrown remnants of his mother's flower garden along the south wall, and Belle stood looking at that garden in the December moonlight and thought about what it would look like in spring. "I want to restore it," she said. "Your mother's garden." Wesley came to stand beside her. "I was hoping you'd say that," he said quietly. She leaned against him and his arm came around her, and they stood looking at the sleeping garden under the winter sky, and Belle thought that this was what it meant to arrive somewhere, not the moment of stepping off a stagecoach in a strange town, but this quiet standing in the moonlight with a person who knew you, next to a garden that needed tending, in a place that was becoming home. The winter was hard, as Texas winters could be, with a freeze in January that came down from the north and killed the early plantings, and kept the ranch hands working double shifts to keep the cattle moving and the water troughs from icing over. Belle learned the specific anxieties of a ranching wife in winter, the watching of the sky for the color that meant a norther coming, the counting of the cattle when they were brought in close, the calculating of feed stores, the management of a household on a ranch where the work did not stop because the weather was difficult. She also learned that she was good at it. She had a head for numbers, which she had always known, and a capacity for organization, and she brought to the running of the ranch household the same qualities she brought to the classroom: patience, attention, the willingness to learn from people who knew things she did not. She learned from Maria, the ranch cook, who was Hector's aunt and who had been running ranch kitchens for 30 years, and she learned from the ranch hands themselves, who discovered early on that the boss's wife was not too proud to listen and adjusted their initial wariness accordingly. By February, she had reorganized the ranch's supply records in a way that saved Wesley 2 days of confusion at the start of the spring preparations, and he looked at the reorganized ledgers with an expression of combined admiration and mild embarrassment that she had managed something he had been meaning to get to for 3 years. "You are frighteningly capable," he told her. "Yes," she agreed pleasantly, and he laughed and pulled her close and kissed her forehead, and she felt warm and competent and entirely at home in her life. Spring came back to the plains in the particular Texas way, slow and then all at once, and Belle's first project of the new season was the garden. She had spent the winter reading everything she could find about kitchen gardens and flower gardens in the Texas climate, and she had written to a seed merchant in Austin, and to a woman named Harriet Bates who wrote a column for the Austin newspaper about frontier gardening, and received back a cheerful and detailed letter full of practical advice. She had also, carefully and with Consulo's help, spoken to several Mexican women in the area about the traditional plants and planting methods that had been used on this land for generations before the Anglo settlers arrived, and what she learned from those conversations gave her a perspective that the seed catalogs could not. She planted the garden on the first warm days of March, with Wesley helping her turn the soil on the afternoons when he could be spared from the spring cattle work. They worked side by side in the turned earth, planting seeds and setting in the small starts she had been nursing in a south window all winter, and the silence between them as they worked was the kind that belongs to people who have settled deep into each other's company, the silence of total ease. Thomas Reyes came to help on a Saturday and was put in charge of the watering schedule, which he managed with the same systematic precision he brought to his arithmetic, and which Belle rewarded with the loan of the Star Atlas for a full month. By April, the garden was greening in a way that would have been recognizable to Wesley's mother, and Belle was also, quietly, and with a mix of wonder and practical concern, aware that she was expecting a child. She told Wesley on an evening in late April, sitting on the porch in the last light, and the way he received the news was characteristic of him. He went very still for a moment, and then he looked at her with an expression that was so full and open and wondering that she felt tears come to her eyes which she did not try to hold back. He reached for her hand. He held it for a long time without speaking. Then he said, very quietly, "Are you well? Are you feeling all right?" "I'm feeling perfectly fine," she said. "A little tired in the mornings, mostly perfectly fine." "Good," he said. He stopped. His voice had gone slightly rough. "Belle," he said. "I know," she said. He brought her hand to his lips and held it there, and she felt the warmth of his breath against her knuckles, and thought that this moment, this ordinary, extraordinary moment on the ranch porch with the garden greening below and the Texas evening spreading enormous and golden above, was one she would carry in her for the rest of her life. She told Martha first, among the people in town, and Martha's response was the proper response, which was immediate and complete joy. She told the children of the school at an appropriate moment later in the spring, and they received the news with a variety of reactions ranging from shy congratulations to Thomas's matter-of-fact observation that she had better stay in Dry Creek now, because they were not getting another teacher. "I intend to," Belle said. Dr. Aubrey, on his bi-weekly circuit visit, examined her and said everything was progressing normally, and that she should rest when she was tired and eat well and not do heavy lifting, all of which she received as confirmation of what she already knew. He also said, with the bluntness of a man who believed in useful information, that the nearest hospital was 40 miles away, and that in the event of complications this would be the relevant fact. Belle received this information and then asked Martha and Consulo and Maria whether they had experience with childbirth, which all three of them had in abundance, and she felt reassured. The summer of 1879 passed in the particular way of a first pregnancy, with great intensity of attention to the body, interspersed with the ordinary business of living which did not pause for the extraordinary. Belle taught school through the spring term and organized the summer recess activities from the ranch, and Wesley hovered in a way that was protective and occasionally excess, but that she found largely endearing, particularly when she caught him reading the obstetrics chapter in the medical reference book he had ordered from a bookseller in Austin and had hidden somewhat ineffectively under his side of the bed. "I found your book," she told him. He looked at her without apology. "I want to know what to expect," he said simply. She loved him for that too, the way he met necessary knowledge without embarrassment. Their son was born in November of 1879, in the ranch house bedroom with Martha and Consuelo both present, during a long night that Belle navigated with the same quality she brought to everything she did, steadily and with determination, and without making it smaller than it was. Wesley waited in the kitchen through the whole night, and Hector Reyes sat with him. And when the morning came and the child's first cry reached them through the bedroom door, both men were on their feet in Wesley's face. When Martha opened the door and told him he could come in, was an expression that those who saw it spoke about afterward as the look of a man whose world had just become more complete than he had known it could be. Belle was exhausted and glowing, and held the bundle of their son with the focused tenderness of someone experiencing an enormity and choosing to meet it squarely. "Hello," she said quietly to the baby. And then she looked up at Wesley, who had come to sit on the edge of the bed beside her, and the look she gave him was one that required no translation. They named him Robert James Graves for both their fathers, and called him Robbie from the first week, because there was nothing of Robert James about him yet, only an increasingly opinionated and physically confident small person who would eventually grow into his formal name. Dry Creek took to the Graves baby with the communal enthusiasm that small towns produce for children of well-liked residents. Dora Hutchins brought a quilt. Clara Boone brought a jar of preserved peaches and said they were for Belle, who needed her strength. Thomas Reyes came to see Robbie with a gravity that suggested he was taking the new arrival seriously, examined him carefully, and pronounced him correctly formed, which Belle accepted as the highest compliment in Thomas's vocabulary. Harold Fitch visited and stood in the doorway holding his hat and looking at the baby in Belle's arms with the expression of a man who had hired this woman on the grounds that she was the only applicant, and was now feeling that he had been considerably more clever than he deserved credit for. The winter of 1879 and 1880 was full in a way that Belle had not imagined when she had stepped off the stagecoach in Dry Creek with her leather satchel and her Tennyson and her unpracticed hope. It was full of the baby and the ranch and the teaching, which she resumed in January with Robbie sleeping in a basket beside her desk to the fascination of the children, who took turns checking on him at recess and reporting back to the class on his status. It was full of Wesley, who was the same person he had always been with the addition of a tenderness that he directed at both his wife and his son with complete unself-consciousness, the tenderness of a man who had decided not to be embarrassed by the things he loved. He had a way of coming in from the range in the evening, trail dirty and tired, and finding Belle and Robbie together, Belle reading aloud with Robbie in her lap, or at the desk writing while Robbie slept, or in the garden with Robbie in the basket beside her in the warm months. And he would stand in the doorway for a moment before she heard him, just watching, and the expression on his face in those unguarded moments was one that Belle eventually began to watch for too, the way she had once watched for the small smile. Because it was the truest thing she knew about who Wesley Graves was. He was a man who knew what he had. He counted it with gratitude every day. In the spring of 1880, Belle expanded the school. She had been planning it all winter. The enrollment had grown to 19 students, and she needed more space. But more than that, she needed someone to help her teach the younger children their letters and numbers while she worked with the older ones. She wrote to Harold Fitch with a proposal for a second room to be added to the schoolhouse and an assistant teacher to be hired. And Harold, who had learned by now that Belle Harper's proposals tended to be both sensible and financially justified, brought it to the town meeting where it passed by a vote of 15-1. The one was Walt Hutchins, who voted no to everything on principle. The second room was built through May and June by a volunteer crew that included Wesley, who showed up on the first Saturday with a hammer and a level and stayed until dark, and Hector, and 3 other ranch hands who seemed to find the project congenial, and Randall Boone, who appeared on the third Saturday without comment and worked harder than anyone. He and Belle did not speak about the town meeting of 1878. They did not need to. The fact of his presence, swinging a hammer in the June heat for a school that his cattle drive taxes were funding, was its own kind of speech. The assistant teacher who arrived in September of 1880 was a young woman named Pearl Ortega, who was 22 and the niece of a ranching family from south of town, and who had enough Spanish and English to be invaluable in a classroom where several of the children spoke Spanish as their first language. Belle liked her immediately, recognizing in Pearl the particular quality of someone who was serious about learning and serious about teaching, and was not going to let anyone suggest otherwise. The 2 women worked together with a compatibility that surprised neither of them, because they were both the kind of people who adapted quickly, once they identified someone worth adapting to. Belle taught Pearl the methods and rhythms of the classroom, and Pearl taught Belle the names of plants in Spanish and the traditional stories that several of the Mexican children carried from their grandparents. And those stories found their way into the curriculum in a way that made Thomas Ray's sit up straighter, and the other Mexican children look as though they had been given something back that they had not known was missing. It was Pearl who first noticed, in the autumn of 1880, that Thomas Ray's was walking past the school sometimes in the evenings, not because he had any business there, but because Anna Hutchins, who was now 13 and had gone from fiction writer to something more like a poet, was often sitting in the window of the school's new room writing in her notebook. And Pearl told Belle about this with an expression of amused and fond observation, and Belle received it the same way, thinking of creek beds and prairie verbena, and the first morning she had looked up and found someone looking at her without laughing. "Watch quietly," she told Pearl. "That particular story will tell itself." By the spring of 1881, Dry Creek had changed enough from the town that had laughed at Belle Harper's blue dress and her Tennyson poems 3 years before that she sometimes stopped and looked at it. The schoolhouse with its new room and its garden of wildflowers along the fence, the streets that she could now navigate by memory in the dark, the faces she knew and that knew hers. The children who came to school reliably and whose parents now debated not whether to send them but whether the curriculum should include more science or more literature. She had not made the land gentle. The land was what it was, enormous, demanding, beautiful, honest, uncompromising. But she had brought gentleness to the place where she stood in it, and it had spread outward from her in the way that water spreads from a stone dropped in a still pool, and the circles of it reached further than she could have imagined on the day she stepped off the coach. One evening in April of 1881, she was sitting on the ranch porch with Robbie asleep in the house behind her and Wesley in the chair beside her, and the evening was doing its particular Texas thing with the colors in the sky, and she was watching a cottontail rabbit move cautiously along the fence line of the garden, and she said, "I've been thinking about something." "Tell me," Wesley said. "I want to write something," she said, "about teaching out here, about what I found and what I thought I would find and how they were different, about what this land needs from the people on it and what it gives back." She paused. "I think there are other women in eastern cities reading notices in newspapers who could use the honest story of what it is actually like." Wesley looked at her with that quality of focused attention that she knew by now was not just hearing but actively listening, taking in all of it and not deciding his response until he had. "You should write it," he said. "You're a fine writer." "I don't know if anyone would print it," she said. "You didn't know if they'd hire you," he said, "or keep you, or let you expand the school. You kept doing the thing anyway." She looked at him in the fading light and felt the love she had for him as something physical, settled in her chest like warmth. "That is an excellent point," she said. "I have my moments," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved. She began writing in the evenings after Robbie was asleep, and the ranch was quiet. At the desk in the parlor with the oil lamp, and the sound of the plains night outside the window. She wrote about Dry Creek and the children and Thomas Ray's star atlas, and the town meeting and the morning on the limestone ridge with the sunrise pouring across the world. She wrote about what it meant to be dismissed as too gentle for the life you had chosen, and to find that the life, once you were in it, agreed with you. She wrote it all carefully and honestly, and sent it in the late summer to 3 different newspapers, not knowing what she expected. The Austin newspaper printed it in September, and then reprinted it at the request of several readers. And Belle received letters from 3 women she had never met who wrote to tell her that they had read her piece and found in it something they had needed, which was the story of someone who had been dismissed and had done the work anyway. She read these letters to Wesley at the breakfast table one September morning, and when she finished reading, he looked at her with that open, unguarded expression and said, "I am so proud of you." She put the letters down and looked at him. Robbie was banging on the table with a spoon, and the ranch sounds were coming through the window, and the morning light was doing what Texas morning light did, which was coming in gold and absolute and generous. "I am proud of us," she said, "of what we built here." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. Outside, the prairie verbena Belle had cultivated along the fence was blooming in small purple clusters, and the garden his mother had planted was green and full, and the schoolhouse roof was solid and dry, and the children of Dry Creek were learning their letters and their wildflower names and the science of the stars, and the wide Texas sky was holding all of it in its enormous, indifferent, magnificent blue. The second child came in the winter of 1882, a girl this time, and they named her Clara Rose Graves, the Clara for the wildflowers more than for Clara Boone, though Clara Boone took a private satisfaction in it anyway. Clara Rose arrived more quickly and easily than Robbie had, and she was from the beginning a different kind of person than her brother, still and watchful where he was active and loud, observant where he was participatory, with her father's direct dark eyes and her mother's tendency to examine small things closely as though they contained important information. Robbie adored her with the wholehearted and slightly overwhelming affection of a toddler, discovering that the new baby was a permanent fixture, and had decided this was acceptable. He brought her things constantly: rocks, a stick, a dried flower, anything that came to hand and seemed to him worthy of sharing, and laid them beside her with an expression of total generosity. Belle watched this and thought about gentle things, about the way gentleness moved from person to person if you let it, the way it was not a quality you lost in hard places, but one you protected and practiced and passed forward. Thomas Ray's turned 16 in the spring of 1882, and Belle and Wesley had a conversation about his future. He was beyond what she could teach him, and they all knew it. He needed more school, better school, the kind that existed in Austin and San Antonio, and places where a young man of his gifts could find teachers who could meet him where he was and take him further. It was Wesley who proposed the solution. He drove out to speak to Hector Ray's one afternoon, and came back with the news that a ranching consortium in Austin was offering scholarships for promising young men to attend the agricultural and technical college that was being developed there, and that Wesley had written a letter of recommendation, and that Belle would write another, and that between the 2 of them and Harold Fitch's official endorsement, they thought the case was strong. Thomas received the scholarship in June. His departure for Austin in August was a school event, a community event, something that Dry Creek marked as a milestone in a way that surprised Thomas and did not surprise Belle at all, because she had understood for 3 years that Thomas Ray's was the kind of person who would mark milestones not because he sought significance, but because significance sought him. Consuelo cried and held her son for a long time at the stagecoach, and then Thomas stood in front of Belle and looked at her with the precise, serious attention of a young man who had learned that attention was the first form of respect. "Miss Harper," he said. And then he corrected himself. "Mrs. Graves, I would like to thank you." "For what specifically?" she asked, because she knew he would have something specific. "For reading to me when I was sick," he said. "For the Star Atlas. For making me believe that what I was good at was worth being good at." He paused. "A lot of people in this town told me I should be realistic, that the land was what mattered and book learning was decoration. You told me knowledge was a form of respect, and I believed you." Belle felt the tears rise and let them come. "Your mother's words," she said. "Almost exactly." Thomas nodded. "I know," he said. "She told me that too later. She said she heard you say it to her in Spanish when you were sitting with me when she thought I was asleep." He met her eyes. "I wasn't asleep." Belle laughed and the tears ran down her face at the same time. She took his hand and shook it formally and then could not help it, hugged him briefly, and he was 17 and grown and he tolerated it with good grace. He climbed onto the stagecoach. Dry Creek watched it go. Belle stood with Wesley's arm around her, and Clara rose on her hip and Robbie pressed against her leg, watching the coach get small against the enormous flat horizon. And she thought that this too was what she was here to do. Not just to fill children with facts, but to send them forward. The rest of that year flowed on with the ordinary richness of a life well made. Belle and Pearl continued to expand the school's reach, and by 1883 they had convinced Harold Fitch to fund a lending library of 30 volumes housed in a cabinet at the back of the main schoolroom, available to any resident of Dry Creek who wanted to borrow. The library was controversial for approximately 2 weeks and then became one of the most used things in the town, because it turned out that what people needed when they were not admitting they needed it was books, the same as always, the same as everywhere. Wesley's ranch prospered in those years. The cattle market was good and the rains were decent, and he managed his land with the same care and thoughtfulness he brought to everything, rotating his grazing and keeping the creek banks intact and maintaining the grass cover in ways that his neighbors occasionally mocked and occasionally envied depending on the season. The land gave him back what he put into it, which was what he had always expected. Robbie started school in 1884 and was not the easiest student, being active and imaginative and perpetually interested in things other than what was currently being presented. But he had his mother's quickness and his father's quiet persistence, and Belle had the wisdom not to teach her own son directly, leaving Robbie to Pearl, who handled him with expert patience and genuine fondness. Clara rose, watching from her basket, and then her play corner on the afternoons Belle brought her to the schoolhouse, was already learning to read at 3 in the way of children who are surrounded by books and readers, and don't know that reading is supposed to be difficult. In 1885, a letter came from Thomas Reyes. He was at the college in Austin and doing well, he wrote, and he had found 2 other students from Mexican families who were in situations similar to his, first-generation learners in institutions that had not entirely decided whether they were welcome, and together the 3 of them were making themselves welcome by the force of their academic performance and their stubborn refusal to be otherwise. He was studying mathematics and surveying. He believed he wanted to work in civil engineering. He had also, he mentioned in a careful final paragraph, met a young woman named Sophia who was a teacher at an Austin school and who reminded him, he said, of a quality of attention that he had first noticed in a school teacher in a small town in West Texas. Belle read this letter aloud to Wesley at the breakfast table. When she finished, Wesley was quiet for a moment. "He turned out right," Wesley said. "He was always right," Belle said. "He just needed the room to be." A postscript at the bottom of Thomas's letter said, "The Star Atlas is in good condition. I have been using it. I intend to return it someday, but I hope not too soon." Belle folded the letter and smiled at it. "He can keep it," she said. "Absolutely not," said Wesley, who had a rancher's view of property and a father's view of children's attachment to things they had been lent. "He's borrowing it. He'll give it back." "He can keep it," Belle repeated. "Write him and tell him to give it back when he's done," Wesley said. She wrote him and told him to keep it as long as he needed it. Wesley pretended not to know this for some months. The years moved on. Dry Creek grew slowly and steadily, as Texas towns did in those decades, adding a hardware store and a dentist who rode a shorter circuit than Dr. Aubrey and a women's sewing circle that invited Belle, which she attended sporadically and always found more interesting than she expected, because under the cover of sewing, women discussed everything of importance. She brought Pearl to the sewing circle, which expanded it and improved the quality of both the sewing and the conversation. Hector Reyes became a foreman rather than a hand, at a ranch north of town that had been sold and brought new owners with money but not experience. And Consuelo became known for the tamales she sold at the town social, which were exceptional, and which everyone agreed were the best thing anyone in 3 counties had ever eaten. Anna Hutchins, who had grown from the girl writing poetry in the schoolroom window into a young woman of considerable verbal ability and not inconsiderable stubbornness, and Thomas Reyes, who came back from Austin in 1887 with his surveying degree and a measured, careful way of seeing the world that had always been there and was now refined, did in fact find their way to each other. Slowly and carefully, and with some opposition from Dora Hutchins, who had complicated feelings about it, and Walt Hutchins, who had a single direct conversation with Thomas Reyes, which apparently covered all the necessary ground, because afterward Walt expressed no further opposition. Belle watched all of this with the feeling of something coming full circle. She and Wesley sat on the porch the evening after Thomas and Anna's wedding in the spring of 1888, Robbie somewhere in the house making a great deal of noise with a toy, Clara Rose in the garden with a book, the evening coming down warm and soft and the air full of the smell of the garden in bloom. "Do you remember," Belle said, "when I first came to Dry Creek and you found me in the creek bed?" "I remember," Wesley said. "You didn't laugh," she said. He turned to look at her. "Why would I laugh? Everyone else did," she said, "or close to it. Blue dress and Tennyson poems and specimen books. They all looked at me and decided I was wrong for this place." "They were wrong," he said simply. "You didn't even know me yet," she said, "but you sat your horse and you didn't laugh and you told me the name of the prairie verbena." He was quiet for a moment. "I knew enough," he said. "Somebody kneeling in the dirt to look at a flower is somebody paying attention to the world. Somebody paying attention to the world is worth knowing." He paused, and I had a feeling. "What kind of feeling?" she asked, though she knew because she had had the same one. "The kind that tells you something important is happening," he said, "that you'd better not look away." She reached over and took his hand, the way he had taken hers on the limestone ridge 10 years before, and they sat in the garden-smelling evening with their hands together, and the sky above Dry Creek went through its sequence of ambers and roses and deep golds, putting on its show for no particular audience, and for every audience, the way it had always done, the way it would go on doing long after both of them were part of the Texas earth. Clara Rose looked up from her book in the garden and called, "Papa, there's a jackrabbit at the fence." "I see it," Wesley called back. "Should we chase it?" "Only if you want to spend the next hour disappointed," he said. Clara Rose considered this with the same analytical precision she brought to everything and returned to her book, which was the correct decision. Robbie burst out of the house at a run, having heard the word jackrabbit, and the jackrabbit was gone before he reached the fence, and he stood there looking at the empty land beyond with his hands on the fence, and then he looked back at his parents on the porch. "It's gone," he announced. "We know," Belle said. "I could have caught it," he said. "Maybe," Wesley said. Robbie came back to the porch and threw himself into the third chair with the boneless ease of a 9-year-old and looked up at the sky, which was spectacular. "It's a good evening," he said, with the frank and total contentment of someone who has not yet learned to take good evenings for granted. "It is," Belle agreed. The ranch went on. The school went on. The garden came back every spring with more abundance than the year before, the soil enriched by years of Belle's careful tending, the prairie verbena spreading along the fence in a way that people in town began to come out just to see when it was in full bloom in early summer, the paintbrush standing red as fire along the south wall where Wesley had built a low stone bed and carried the plants down from the ridge one careful autumn. Belle's piece in the Austin newspaper had been followed by 4 more over the years, and she had received letters from women in Ohio and Pennsylvania and Georgia who were reading them in the way that she had once read her father's adventure stories, looking for the story of someone who had done the thing and come out the other side of it knowing it was the right thing to have done. She was not famous. She was not notable in any way that would appear in a history book. She was a woman in a small Texas town who had come when no one else would, and had done the work without flinching, and had built something out of that work, and had been met on a creek bank by a man who saw what she was doing, and said it was right, and they had built something together that was larger than either of them had imagined when they were standing on opposite sides of a threshold leaning forward. The closed circle of it, the satisfying completeness, was not something Belle took for granted. She had been alone in a stagecoach with a leather satchel and a borrowed dream, and now she was here on this porch in this evening, with this man beside her and these children in the garden, and the house behind her full of books and the schoolhouse full of learning, and the town around her full of lives she had touched and been touched by in return. In 1889, Thomas Rays came back to Dry Creek. Not to stay exactly, but to work. The county needed a surveyor, and Thomas was the best available, and had roots that ran deep in this particular ground. He and Anna built a small house on the east end of town, and Anna started a Saturday writing circle for the older schoolchildren, which was Pearl's idea and an excellent one, and Thomas began the long, careful work of mapping the county's water sources, which would matter more than anyone yet knew when the next drought came. He brought the star atlas back when he came. He left it on Belle's kitchen table one morning while she was in the school, and when she came home and found it there, she stood looking at it for a long time. It was worn nearly to falling apart, the binding cracked and the pages soft with use, and there were pencil annotations in Thomas's precise handwriting on nearly every page, stars he had seen from new longitudes, observations he had made, the coordinates of places he had stood and looked up and found the sky arranged above him. She did not put it back on the school window ledge. She kept it on the kitchen table where it could be seen. The spring of 1890 was warm and early, and the garden came in ahead of itself, and Belle stood in the middle of it one March morning with the sun full and warm on her face, and the smell of turned earth and new green things rising around her, and Wesley came up behind her and put his arms around her from behind and rested his chin on top of her head. "Happy?" he asked. She thought about the word. About all the things it contained and did not contain, all the complexity that honest happiness holds, the grief that lives alongside it for the ones who are gone, the uncertainty that persists despite it, the knowledge that the land and life are never entirely safe and never entirely generous, only sometimes and enough. "Yes," she said, "completely." He held her in the garden, and the Texas morning went on being the Texas morning, which was to say enormous and honest, and more beautiful than anyone had the right to expect. Robbie's voice reached them from somewhere inside the house, asking about breakfast with the focused urgency of a 10-year-old whose priorities were clear and whose patience was limited. Clara Rose was already in the garden, crouched by the verbena the way her mother had crouched in a creek bed 12 years ago, examining something small and important with total, gentle attention. Belle watched her daughter and felt the long thread of it run from her own hands through to her child's, the way gentleness passed between people when you chose to treat it as something worth passing on rather than a liability to be discarded. "Come look at this," Clara Rose called. She had found a bee, a large, drowsy one moving through the verbena with the focused industry of its kind. Belle came and crouched beside her daughter. Wesley came and crouched on the other side. The three of them watched the bee in the morning light, its movement from flower to flower precise and purposeful, and the bee cared nothing for their watching and went about its business with complete dignity. "What's it doing?" Clara Rose asked. "Collecting pollen," Belle said. "For what?" "For honey," Wesley said. "For the hive." "For everything the hive needs." Clara Rose considered this. "It doesn't get to keep what it collects for itself," she said. "No," Belle said, "but it keeps the hive alive. And the hive keeps it alive." Clara Rose thought about this for a long moment in the way that she thought about things, thoroughly and without rushing. "That seems right," she said at last. And it did. It was. Belle looked at the bee and the verbena and her daughter's bright, serious face and her husband's hand resting easy on his knee beside her. And the garden stretched out around them, and the schoolhouse waited at the end of the road. And Dry Creek was beginning its morning sounds. The horses and the fires and the voices of people starting their day in a place where they had chosen to be and had made something real. It all seemed right. It all seemed more than she had known to hope for, and exactly what she had always, in the quietest and most honest part of herself, been working toward. The land did not become gentle, but the people in it had a chance to be, when someone showed them that gentle was not weakness but the deepest and most enduring form of strength. Belle Harper had come to a place that dismissed her and had stayed and made herself necessary in a way that no one could dismiss anymore. Not because she had become hard, but because she had remained what she was and taught the land, and the people on it, what that was worth. And Wesley Graves, who had said so from the beginning, watched his wife in the morning light of their garden and felt the particular satisfaction of a man who has been proven right about something that mattered deeply and is glad, every day, to go on being proven right. The bee flew on. The verbena bloomed. The morning spread its gold across the plain. And the story of Belle Harper and Wesley Graves settled into the ordinary, extraordinary, fully closed and fully realized life they had built together. Here on this demanding, beautiful, honest ground, and it was good, and it was enough, and it was home.